Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to the 15th century, to a time when marriage had absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with land, alliances, and keeping your family from being murdered by the family next door. So, get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's wander through the deeply awkward world of medieval matchmaking, where a 12-year-old could be betrothed to a 40-year-old duke, and everyone just nodded and said, "Yes, this seems fine." Now, if you're listening to this in bed, wondering how people in the 1400s approached romance, I have some news for you. They didn't. Romance was for troubadours and poetry. Marriage was a business transaction, preferably conducted between two families who had enough land and soldiers to make the whole thing worthwhile. Love was something that might happen accidentally, years later, if you were very lucky, but no one was counting on it. Let's start with the basics. In the 15th century, marriage among the nobility was essentially a board game where the pieces were human beings and the goal was to acquire as much territory as possible without accidentally starting a war. Although, to be fair, sometimes starting a war was also the goal. It depended on the week. The average noble bride was somewhere between 12 and 16 years old when she was married off. The groom could be any age, really. 30, 40, 50, sometimes older. No one seemed particularly bothered by this. The idea was to get the girl married before she had any opinions about it, and to secure the alliance before another family could swoop in with a better offer. These marriages were arranged by the parents, naturally, often before the bride and groom had ever met. And I mean that literally. You could be betrothed to someone in another country, someone whose language you didn't speak, someone you'd never seen a portrait of, and the first time you'd lay eyes on them would be at the altar. Surprise, this is your husband, he's 53 and enjoys falconry. The wedding night was, of course, a whole situation. Because these marriages needed to be consummated to be legally binding, there was often a ceremonial bedding where the bride and groom were escorted to the bedroom by a crowd of witnesses. Yes, witnesses. People would stand outside the room or sometimes inside the room to make sure the marriage was properly consummated. Privacy was not a 15th century value. Now, you might think, surely there were some love matches, surely some couples actually liked each other, and yes, occasionally, by sheer statistical accident, two people who were forced to marry each other turned out to be compatible. But this was considered a delightful bonus, not the point. The point was alliances. The point was heirs. The point was making sure your daughter's children would inherit a nice chunk of Burgundy. Let's talk about the courtship process, or rather, the lack of one. If you were a noblewoman in the 1400s, your father or your king would simply inform you one day that you were going to marry someone. You didn't get to meet him first. You didn't get to date. You didn't get to have a trial period where you figured out if you could tolerate his habit of chewing with his mouth open. You just got a letter one day that said, essentially, pack your things, you're moving to Castile. And if you were very, very lucky, someone might send you a portrait of your future husband before the wedding. These portraits were, of course, wildly flattering. Every prince looked like a golden-haired angel in his official portrait, even if in real life he resembled a mildly confused turnip. So you'd show up at the wedding expecting someone who looked vaguely human, and instead you'd get, well, we'll talk about some specific examples later. The wedding itself was an enormous affair, because this wasn't just about two people. This was about two families, two regions, sometimes two countries. There would be feasts that lasted for days. There would be tournaments where knights would joust and occasionally die, which was considered festive. There would be musicians and acrobats and whole roasted swans, because apparently in the 1400s, the fancier the bird, the more important the wedding. But here's the thing about these grand celebrations. The bride and groom were basically props. They'd sit at the high table, looking appropriately solemn, while everyone else got drunk and congratulated themselves on what a brilliant alliance this was. The couple's actual feelings about each other were irrelevant. They were there to smile, consummate the marriage, and start producing heirs as quickly as possible. And speaking of heirs, let's talk about the actual purpose of these marriages, which was, of course, children, specifically sons. Daughters were fine, useful even, because you could marry them off to someone else later, but what you really needed was a son. preferably several sons, in case the first one died of plague or fell off a horse or choked on a piece of badly cooked meat. The pressure on noblewomen to produce heirs was immense. You were expected to get pregnant immediately, stay pregnant as often as possible, and keep having children until you produced a male heir or died trying. And unfortunately, many women did die trying. Childbirth in the 15th century was incredibly dangerous. There were no antibiotics, no real understanding of hygiene, and no real pain relief beyond maybe some wine and prayer. If you failed to produce a son, this was considered your fault, naturally. Never mind that the gender of a child is determined by the father's contribution. Medieval people didn't know that. They just knew that some women had sons and some women didn't. And if you were in the second category, your husband might start looking around for a way to annul the marriage and try again with someone else. Which brings us to annulments. Divorce wasn't really a thing in the Catholic 15th century, but annulments were possible if you could come up with a good enough reason. The most popular reason was consanguinity, which is a fancy way of saying you and your spouse were too closely related. And in the tangled mess of European nobility, where everyone was marrying everyone else's cousins, this was often true. You could be married for 10 years, have 3 children together, and then suddenly, very conveniently, discover that you and your wife were third cousins, which meant the marriage had never been valid in the first place. How fortunate. Now you could marry that younger, prettier princess from France. Of course, getting an annulment required the Pope's permission, which meant you needed to be either very powerful or very persuasive, or very generous with donations to the church. Money, as always, helped smooth these things along. But let's get back to the wedding night, because this is where things got particularly awkward. Remember, these were often very young brides marrying much older men. A 14-year-old girl who'd been pulled out of a convent, where she'd been living a quiet, sheltered life, would suddenly find herself in bed with a 35-year-old stranger who expected her to know what to do, which she absolutely did not. There was some attempt at education, usually from older married women who would have a deeply uncomfortable conversation with the bride a day or two before the wedding. But this education was, shall we say, limited. It mainly consisted of do what your husband tells you and try not to cry too loudly. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to know what he was doing, though often he didn't either. If this was his first marriage, he might be just as clueless as his bride. But because he was a man, he was supposed to pretend he had everything under control. This led to a lot of fumbling, awkward wedding nights where 2 terrified teenagers tried to figure out what they were supposed to be doing while a crowd of people waited outside the door. And yes, afterward, the bed sheets would sometimes be inspected to prove that the marriage had been consummated and that the bride had been a virgin, because apparently, in the 1400s, people had no sense of boundaries whatsoever. Now, let's talk about what happened after the wedding. If you were a noble bride, you'd move to your husband's household, which might be in a completely different country. You'd be surrounded by people who spoke a different language, ate different food, and had different customs. You'd be expected to learn all of this quickly, manage a large household, oversee dozens of servants, and, oh yes, also get pregnant immediately. Your husband, meanwhile, would probably be off doing whatever noblemen did: hunting, fighting, attending court, having affairs. Yes, affairs. Because while you were expected to be faithful unto death, your husband had no such obligation. He could have mistresses, illegitimate children, and entire second families, and this was just considered normal behavior for a man of his station. If you complained about this, you'd be told you were being hysterical. If you had an affair of your own, you could be executed for treason, because any children you had needed to be legitimately your husband's, or else the whole inheritance situation fell apart. So the rules were, shall we say, a bit one-sided. Let's drift over to the subject of royal mistresses, because this was a whole institution in itself. Kings and princes didn't just have mistresses, they had official mistresses who were given titles and lands, and sometimes more influence than the actual queen. The queen, meanwhile, was expected to smile and pretend she didn't notice that her husband was openly living with another woman. Some queens handled this better than others. Some became friends with their husbands' mistresses, figuring that if you can't beat them, you might as well have someone to talk to at dinner.
Others were less gracious about it. There are records of queens who made their husbands' mistresses' lives absolutely miserable in small, petty ways, seating them at the far end of the table, excluding them from important ceremonies, spreading rumors about them. It wasn't much, but it was something. The children from these affairs, the illegitimate ones, occupied a strange position in society. They couldn't inherit the throne, but they could be given lands and titles. They could be married off to useful allies. They could even be legitimized later if the king needed an heir and his wife had inconveniently failed to produce a son. Legitimacy was surprisingly flexible when it needed to be. But back to our noble bride, who at this point has been married for a year or two and has probably had her first child. If she's lucky, the child survived. If she's very lucky, it was a boy. If she's unlucky, the child died in infancy, which happened roughly half the time. And now she's expected to get pregnant again, and again, and again. This cycle would continue as long as she was able to have children. Some women had 10 or 12 children, some had more. Many of these children wouldn't survive to adulthood. Infant mortality was staggering. Childhood diseases, accidents, simple infections that today would be cured with antibiotics, all of these killed children constantly. And every time a child died, the mother was expected to grieve privately, briefly, and then get pregnant again as soon as possible. Because the goal wasn't to have children you loved, the goal was to have heirs who would survive long enough to inherit. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone in the 1400s ever marry for love? And the answer is sometimes, but usually by accident. There are a few cases of noblemen who fell genuinely in love with their wives after the wedding and chose not to take mistresses. There are cases of couples who wrote each other affectionate letters and seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. And even in these cases, the marriage had still been arranged for political reasons. The love just happened to develop afterwards as a happy coincidence. For most noble couples, marriage was something you endured. You did your duty. You produced heirs. You managed your separate lives and tried not to actively hate each other. And if you were very, very fortunate, you might develop a kind of comfortable partnership over the years. You might even become friends. But love? That was something that happened in songs, not in real life. Let's drift now to one of the most famously inbred families in European history, the Habsburgs. If you've ever seen a portrait of a Habsburg monarch and thought, that chin looks structurally unsound, you were absolutely correct. The Habsburgs spent several centuries marrying their cousins, and by the late 1600s, they'd essentially bred themselves into a genetic corner. But we're starting in the 1400s, when the Habsburgs were just beginning their long, slow descent into what we might charitably call dynastic experimentation. The Habsburg family originated in what is now Switzerland and Austria, and they had a motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," which sounds lovely until you realize what they actually meant was, let's marry our relatives over and over until we own everything. And it worked, sort of. Through strategic marriages, the Habsburgs ended up ruling vast chunks of Europe, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, parts of Germany. They were everywhere. Unfortunately, they were also increasingly related to themselves. The problem started innocently enough. When you're a royal family trying to hold on to power, you want to marry people of your own status.
Children to other powerful families. But there are only so many powerful families, and they're all doing the same thing. So you end up marrying your daughter to your cousin, and then your grandson marries his cousin, and then your great-grandson marries his cousin, who is also his niece, because at this point the family tree is less a tree and more a wreath. The most infamous example of Habsburg inbreeding is Charles II of Spain, but he came later, in the 1600s. We're interested in the earlier Habsburgs, the ones who started this whole mess. Let's talk about Frederick III, who was Holy Roman Emperor from 1452 to 1493. Frederick was not particularly inbred yet, but he set the stage for everything that came after. He was obsessed with maintaining Habsburg power, and his solution was to marry his son, Maximilian, to Mary of Burgundy, who was one of the richest heiresses in Europe. This was actually a brilliant match, politically speaking. Mary brought with her the Netherlands and Burgundy, and Maximilian brought, Well, he brought a nice jaw and a lot of ambition. Together, they had 2 children, Philip and Margaret. And this is where things start to get interesting, genetically speaking. Philip, who would later be known as Philip the Handsome, because of course he was, married Joanna of Castile. Now, Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who were themselves second cousins, so already we're working with a somewhat limited gene pool. Philip and Joanna had 6 children, including Charles V, who would become one of the most powerful rulers in European history. Charles inherited an absolutely absurd amount of territory: Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, colonies in the Americas. He was so powerful that he supposedly said the sun never set on his empire, which was true, but also exhausting. Ruling that much territory required constant travel, constant diplomacy, and constant warfare. But here's the thing about Charles V. He was already noticeably inbred. His jaw jutted out slightly. His lower teeth didn't properly meet his upper teeth, which made eating difficult. This was the famous Habsburg jaw, also known as mandibular prognathism, and it would only get worse with each generation. Charles V knew this was a problem. He could see what was happening to his family, so he tried, sort of, to diversify the gene pool by marrying his cousin Isabella of Portugal, who was, yes, his first cousin, because apparently diversifying the gene pool meant something very different in the 16th century. Charles and Isabella had 6 children, though only 3 survived to adulthood. Their son, Philip II, inherited Spain and the Netherlands, and he continued the grand Habsburg tradition of marrying relatives. He married 4 times, and 3 of his wives were relatives. His last wife, Anna of Austria, was his niece, his own niece. By this point, the genetic problems were becoming impossible to ignore. Philip II's son, Don Carlos, was severely disabled, both physically and mentally. He had a pronounced Habsburg jaw, a hunched back, and violent mood swings. He was unstable, erratic, and eventually had to be imprisoned by his own father. But the Habsburgs pressed on, because what's a little genetic deterioration when you've got an empire to maintain? Philip II's daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia, married her cousin Albert. Philip III married his cousin Margaret of Austria. Philip IV married his cousin Elizabeth of France, and then, after she died, his niece Mariana of Austria, who was 30 years younger than him. And then we get to Charles II, the final tragic culmination of centuries of inbreeding. Charles II, who was so inbred that his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child born to siblings. Charles II, who couldn't chew his own food because his Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that his teeth didn't meet. Charles II, who couldn't speak clearly until he was 8 years old. Charles II, who was intellectually disabled, physically weak, and constantly ill. Charles II died at the age of 38 without producing an heir, despite 2 marriages. His death ended the Habsburg line in Spain and sparked the War of Spanish Succession, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, all because a family had spent 200 years marrying their cousins. But let's drift back to the earlier Habsburgs, before things got quite so dire, because the 1400s and 1500s were when the family was still functional, still powerful, and only beginning to notice that something might be going slightly wrong. Maximilian I, Frederick's son, was actually quite capable. He was a skilled warrior, a decent administrator, and genuinely interested in the arts and sciences. He also had a relatively normal jaw, which was fortunate for him. He married twice, first to Mary of Burgundy, who died young after a hunting accident, and then to Bianca Maria Sforza, who brought a large dowry but no children. Maximilian's grandson, Charles V, who we mentioned earlier, was a formidable ruler. He spent his entire reign trying to hold his massive empire together while fighting off the Ottoman Empire, dealing with the Protestant Reformation, and managing family drama. His brother Ferdinand wanted more power. His son Philip was sullen and difficult. His various cousins and nephews kept scheming against each other.
Charles V eventually abdicated, split his empire between his brother and his son, and retired to a monastery where he died 2 years later. One imagines he was quite tired. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, descended from Ferdinand, kept ruling the Holy Roman Empire and later Austria-Hungary. They kept marrying their relatives, naturally, but they were slightly less inbred than the Spanish branch. Slightly. The Spanish branch, meanwhile, kept doubling down on the cousin marriages until they bred themselves out of existence. It's almost impressive, in a deeply sad way. Now, you might wonder why they kept doing this. Why, when they could clearly see that their children were being born with physical and mental disabilities, did they continue marrying their relatives? The answer is power. Every marriage was a political calculation. Marrying outside the family meant sharing power with outsiders, and the Habsburgs didn't want to do that. They wanted to keep everything in the family. Literally. There was also a religious element. The Habsburgs were devoutly Catholic, and the Catholic Church had strict rules about marriage.
Who could marry whom? But these rules could be bent with the right papal dispensation. And the Habsburgs were very good at getting papal dispensations because they were very good at donating large sums of money to the church. So they kept marrying their cousins and nieces and occasionally their aunts, and everyone just sort of pretended this was normal. The portraits from this era are fascinating because you can watch the Habsburg jaw grow more pronounced with each generation. In early portraits, it's barely noticeable. By the 1600s, it dominates the entire face. The family also developed other health problems. Epilepsy was common. Infertility was rampant. Many Habsburg children died young or were born with severe disabilities. The infant mortality rate was staggering, even by the standards of the time. And yet they persisted because giving up would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, marrying your niece was a bad idea. Let's talk about Joanna of Castile, because her story is one of the most tragic and bizarre in royal history. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the monarchs who funded Christopher Columbus and kicked off the Spanish Inquisition. She grew up in a deeply religious household, was well-educated, and by all accounts was intelligent and capable. And then she married Philip the Handsome, and everything went wrong. Philip was, as his nickname suggests, very attractive. He was charming, he was cultured, and he was completely unfaithful. From the moment they were married, Philip had affairs, constantly, with everyone. He didn't even try to be discreet about it. Joanna, who apparently actually loved her husband, unusual for a political marriage, did not handle this well. She became obsessed with Philip's infidelities. She would follow him around, trying to catch him with his mistresses. She once attacked a woman she suspected of sleeping with Philip, cutting off the woman's hair in a fit of rage. This behavior was considered, shall we say, inappropriate for a queen. Joanna was supposed to ignore her husband's affairs like every other noblewoman. The fact that she cared this much was seen as evidence that she was unstable. And maybe she was, but it's hard to say how much of Joanna's erratic behavior was mental illness and how much was a reasonable response to being trapped in a miserable marriage while everyone told her she was crazy for being upset about it. Joanna and Philip had 6 children together, despite the fact that their marriage was, by all accounts, absolutely miserable. Philip would humiliate Joanna publicly, flaunting his mistresses in front of her. Joanna would have screaming fits and refuse to eat or sleep for days. In 1506, Philip died suddenly at the age of 28. The cause of death was probably typhoid fever, though of course there were rumors of poisoning. There are always rumors of poisoning. Joanna's response to Philip's death was not great. She refused to let his body be buried. She had his coffin carried around with her wherever she went, opening it periodically to look at his corpse. She would sleep next to the coffin. She insisted that Philip wasn't really dead, that he would wake up eventually. This went on for months. Now, it's worth noting that Joanna had just lost the person she loved most in the world, even though he'd treated her terribly. Grief can make people do strange things. But by 16th century standards, traveling around with your husband's rotting corpse was considered beyond the pale. Joanna's father, Ferdinand, used this as an excuse to have her declared insane and locked up.
She spent the next 46 years imprisoned in a convent in Tordesillas, while her father and later her son, Charles V, ruled in her name. Was Joanna actually insane? It's hard to say. She was definitely depressed. She probably had what we'd now recognize as severe mental health issues, but she was also a woman who showed emotions in a time when women weren't supposed to have emotions, and that was enough to get her locked away for the rest of her life. Her imprisonment was, by all accounts, grim. She was kept in a small set of rooms with minimal furniture and no comforts. She was rarely allowed to see her children. She was forbidden from attending Mass for years because her father decided she was too unstable to be led into a church. Joanna spent decades in that convent, growing increasingly withdrawn and depressed. She would go days without speaking. She refused to change her clothes or bathe. She was, quite understandably, completely miserable. And yet, when her son, Charles V, visited her, she was apparently lucid enough to discuss politics and ask intelligent questions about the state of the realm, which suggests that maybe she wasn't as insane as everyone claimed. Maybe she was just traumatized, depressed, and desperately isolated. Joanna died in 1555, at the age of 75, still imprisoned. She'd spent more than half her life locked away, ostensibly for her own good. Her story is a reminder that in the 16th century, mental illness was not understood at all, and the treatment for it was essentially lock the person up and hope they get better, which they never did, because isolation and imprisonment are not effective treatments for depression or grief. Joanna's children, meanwhile, went on to have their own deeply dysfunctional lives. Her son, Charles V, spent his entire reign fighting wars and dealing with the Protestant Reformation before abdicating and dying in a monastery. Her daughter, Catherine, married the King of Portugal and died in childbirth. Her son, Ferdinand, became Holy Roman Emperor and spent his time fighting the Ottomans. None of them seem to have been particularly happy, which is perhaps not surprising given that their mother was locked up and their father died young after spending his entire life cheating on said mother. The whole family was a mess, basically. A rich, powerful mess, but a mess. Let's drift over to England now, because we can't talk about dysfunctional royal families without mentioning the Tudors, and specifically Henry VIII, who managed to have 6 wives and yet still ended up with only 3 children who survived to adulthood, none of whom were particularly healthy. Henry VIII is famous for many things: his 6 wives, his break with the Catholic Church, his tendency to execute people who annoyed him. But we're interested in his children, because all 3 of them were, in various ways, deeply unwell. Let's start with Mary, Henry's eldest child. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. She grew up knowing she was the heir to the throne, and then suddenly her father decided he wanted a divorce, their marriage was annulled, and Mary was declared illegitimate. This was understandably quite traumatic for a teenage girl. Mary went from being Princess of Wales to being legally a bastard, stripped of her title and her household. She was forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her baby half-sister Elizabeth, which must have been absolutely humiliating. Mary's health
was never good. She suffered from chronic headaches, probably migraines. She had painful, irregular periods that left her bedridden for days. She was frequently depressed, which, again, is understandable given the circumstances. When Mary finally became queen in 1553, at the age of 37, she was determined to do 2 things: restore Catholicism to England and produce an heir. She married Philip II of Spain, who was 11 years younger than her and openly uninterested in her. Mary became convinced she was pregnant, twice. Both times, she wasn't. These were likely pseudocyesis, or phantom pregnancies, caused by a desperate desire to have a child, combined with possible hormonal imbalances or ovarian tumors. The first phantom pregnancy lasted for months. Mary's belly swelled. She felt the baby move. She prepared a nursery and issued announcements about the impending birth. And then, nothing. No baby. The doctors quietly announced that they'd miscalculated the due date. Mary waited, still no baby. Eventually, everyone had to admit that there was no baby, and there never had been. Mary was devastated. She was humiliated, and she was still without an heir.
The second phantom pregnancy happened a few years later and followed the same pattern. Mary announced she was pregnant, her belly swelled, and then nothing happened. By this point, most people didn't even pretend to believe her. Mary died in 1558 at the age of 42, probably of ovarian or uterine cancer, still childless and still convinced that God was punishing her for something. Now let's talk about Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, the one he had executed. Elizabeth grew up knowing that her mother had been beheaded when she was 2 years old and that her father had declared her illegitimate. Elizabeth's childhood was, shall we say, unstable. She was in and out of favor depending on which of Henry's wives was currently alive and whether or not they liked her. When her half-brother Edward was born, Elizabeth was even further demoted in the line of succession. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, suspected of treason. She was terrified she would be executed like her mother. She wasn't, but the experience left its mark. When Elizabeth finally became queen in 1558, she decided she was never going to marry. She'd watched her father cycle through 6 wives, seen her sister's disastrous marriage to Philip, and concluded that marriage was a trap that would cost her her power. So Elizabeth remained single for her entire 45-year reign, which was absolutely unheard of for a queen. Everyone told her she needed to marry and produce an heir. Elizabeth ignored them all. But here's the thing. Elizabeth was not particularly healthy either. She had bouts of illness throughout her life. She suffered from what were probably migraines, like her sister. She had terrible dental problems. Her teeth were black and rotting by the time she was in her 50s, which was considered normal for the time, but still painful. She also had smallpox at the age of 29, which nearly killed her and left her face pockmarked. This was a disaster for a queen whose authority partly rested on her image. Elizabeth compensated by coating her face in white lead makeup, which gave her a pale, flawless appearance in portraits, but was also slowly poisoning her. By the end of her life, Elizabeth was a wreck. She was nearly bald, so she wore elaborate wigs, her teeth were gone, her face was damaged from decades of lead poisoning, she refused to look in mirrors. And she still had no heir, which meant that when she died in 1603, the Tudor line died with her. Now let's talk about Edward, Henry's only legitimate son. Edward was the child Henry had wanted so desperately, the son who would continue the Tudor line. Henry had executed people to get a son. He'd broken with Rome, divorced 2 wives, and married 4 more, all in pursuit of a male heir. And he got one. Edward was born to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife. Jane died 12 days later of puerperal fever, but Edward survived. Edward was a sickly child from the start. He had frequent illnesses, probably because his immune system was weak. He was kept isolated and protected, which probably made things worse. Henry VIII was so paranoid about Edward's health that the boy was barely allowed to go outside. When Edward became king at the age of 9 after Henry's death in 1947, he was already frail. He tried to be a good king, studying hard and taking his duties seriously, but his health continued to deteriorate. By the time Edward was 15, he was coughing up blood. He had tuberculosis, or possibly a combination of tuberculosis and other infections. His doctors tried everything: bloodletting, poultices, various concoctions made from herbs and minerals. Nothing worked. Edward died in 1553 at the age of 15, having reigned for only 6 years. His death threw England into chaos, as various factions fought over who should succeed him. So, to summarize, all 3 of Henry VIII's surviving children were chronically ill, never had children of their own, and died relatively young. Mary at 42, Edward at 15, Elizabeth at 69. The Tudor line, which Henry had fought so hard to secure, ended with Elizabeth. And the reason all 3 children were so sickly is probably related to Henry VIII himself. Henry was healthy in his youth, but by his later years he had chronic leg ulcers, probably from osteomyelitis following a jousting accident. These ulcers were infected and never properly healed, which meant Henry was likely suffering from chronic infection and possibly sepsis for years. He was also morbidly obese by the time he died, with a waist circumference of over 50 inches. His diet was terrible. He ate enormous amounts of meat and drank heavily. He probably had diabetes and gout. All of this suggests that Henry's health was poor when he fathered his children, which may have affected their health as well. Add in the stress and trauma of growing up in Henry's court, where people were executed regularly and marriages were annulled on a whim, and it's no surprise that all three children had significant physical and mental health problems.